States. The conflict between Denmark and the US over Greenland began after Trump said the US needs the island for security reasons and its resources. He has refused to rule out the use of force to secure it.
Well, I think the president is moving full speed ahead. And look, what we're seeing, how the president is moving as it relates to Greenland, is no different with how the president is also responding to Canada. The president made clear when he was elected that he would engage in economic warfare to make Canada.
This is not a rumor. This is not a slip of the tongue. And this is definitely not political theater. When the President of the United States openly entertains the idea of annexing Greenland, the message is not aimed at Denmark alone. It is a signal to allies, to rivals, and to Americans themselves that a line has been crossed. Greenland is not being discussed as a partner. It is being discussed as an asset, and that distinction matters. What makes this moment alarming is not just the ambition, but the method. The administration is no longer relying on Congress, treaties, or consensus. Instead, it is moving through executive shortcuts, special envoys, unilateral appointments, and public rhetoric that normalizes the idea of territorial expansion in the 21st century. This is not how democracies traditionally project power. This is how empires test boundaries. And Greenland is only the opening move. Because the language used around Greenland mirrors language that has already been used elsewhere, especially toward Canada. Economic warfare, trade coercion, public jokes about sovereignty that stop sounding like jokes once policy begins to follow rhetoric. The real shock is not that this idea exists, it is that it is being said out loud. And once something like this is normalized in public discourse, the question is no longer if the strategy expands, but where it goes next. Greenland is not valuable because of its population. It is valuable because of its position. Sitting at the gateway to the Arctic, Greenland controls access to emerging shipping routes, advanced missile detection systems, and the future military balance of the Northern Hemisphere. As polar ice recedes, Greenland becomes less remote and far more strategic. This is why Greenland has quietly become one of the most militarily sensitive territories on Earth. But here is the complication. Greenland is tied to Denmark, and Denmark is a NATO member. That single fact transforms a reckless idea into a potentially explosive one. This is no longer an abstract debate. When Denmark summoned the U.S. ambassador over the Greenland envoy appointment, it marked the moment rhetoric crossed into diplomatic rupture. Any attempt, even rhetorical, to use military force or coercive pressure against Greenland risks triggering alliance obligations that were never designed for internal power plays among allies. NATO was built to deter external threats, not to manage expansionist impulses from within. And yet, the administration appears willing to probe that ambiguity. By floating the idea publicly, it forces allies into an impossible position. Respond too strongly and escalate tensions. Respond too weakly and normalize the concept of annexation. Greenland is not silent. As the new U.S. envoy's remarks sparked backlash, Greenland's response was blunt. Its future is not Washington's to decide. This is why Greenland matters beyond geography. It represents a stress test for the Western alliance itself. If norms can be bent here, under the justification of strategic necessity, then the precedent does not stay in the Arctic, it travels. And once precedent travels, it rarely returns quietly. What makes this strategy particularly dangerous is not only what is being proposed, but how it is being pursued. The mechanism is already in motion. With the appointment of a special envoy for Greenland, the administration demonstrated how easily ambition can be converted into action, quietly, legally, and without institutional friction. The appointment of a special envoy without congressional approval is not illegal, but it is revealing. It allows the executive branch to bypass scrutiny, debate, and institutional friction. In other words, it allows action without accountability. This is the same mechanism used repeatedly across different theaters. Trade agreements are threatened unilaterally. Sanctions are weaponized without long-term strategy. Diplomacy is reframed as pressure, not negotiation. And when you step back, a pattern emerges. The administration is testing how far it can move independently of the traditional checks and balances that have restrained American power for decades. Each move pushes slightly further, waiting to see where resistance appears and where it does not. Greenland fits perfectly into this pattern. So does Canada. If the United States were to withdraw from major trade frameworks or escalate economic coercion under the guise of renegotiation, it would signal that sovereignty itself has become negotiable, contingent on leverage rather than law. That is why this moment sends a chill not just through allied capitals, but through American institutions themselves. Because once power learns it can move without restraint, it rarely chooses to stop on its own. And this is only the beginning. Canada is not Greenland, and that is precisely why it matters more. Unlike Greenland, Canada is not a remote territory or a peripheral asset. It is a sovereign state with deep economic integration, shared defense infrastructure, and one of the most complex bilateral relationships in modern history, which makes the rhetoric surrounding Canada all the more unsettling. Because the language has already shifted. What once sounded like provocation now increasingly resembles conditioning. The repeated framing of Canada as economically dependent, the casual references to it as a future state, the suggestion that trade pressure is not merely a negotiating tactic, but a tool of transformation. Economic warfare is the chosen instrument. Threats to withdraw from major trade frameworks are not symbolic. They strike at supply chains, currency stability, investment confidence, and political legitimacy. The costs of economic coercion do not remain contained. As cross-border travel froze, U.S. tourism absorbed a measurable shock, a reminder that leverage cuts both ways. And unlike military force, economic pressure allows plausible deniability. It can be framed as policy, not aggression. But intent matters more than framing. When trade coercion is paired with rhetoric questioning sovereignty, the line between negotiation and domination begins to blur. Canadian scholars have been explicit about what this represents. Economic coercion framed as integration is neither viable nor legal, and the constitutional barriers to any such outcome are prohibitive.
What is being tested is not Canada's economy alone, but its political resilience under sustained pressure from its closest ally. This is why comparisons to Greenland are not exaggerations, they are signals. Greenland shows how territorial language is normalized. Canada shows how economic leverage is applied. Together, they form a two-track strategy. Soften norms in one arena, apply pressure in another. And once that strategy is proven effective, it becomes reusable. To understand where this path leads, one does not need to speculate. The model already exists. Venezuela provides the blueprint. In Venezuela, economic pressure came first. Sanctions, isolation, financial strangulation. It was framed as moral intervention, then humanitarian necessity, then strategic containment. Each step justified the next. What matters is not the moral framing, but the sequence. Economic tools created instability. Instability justified escalation. Escalation normalized exceptional measures. This is not about ideology, it is about method. When the same administration discusses Greenland, pressures Canada, and applies forceful economic tactics elsewhere, it reveals a governing philosophy that views power as cumulative and precedent as disposable. The danger is not that these cases are identical, the danger is that they are connected. Each instance lowers the threshold for the next. Each successful bypass of restraint teaches the system that restraint is optional. And once restraint becomes optional, it eventually becomes inconvenient. This is why analysts describe the current moment as chilling, not because of any single action, but because of the trajectory. If economic warfare can be used to redefine sovereignty in one region, it can be attempted in another. If executive power can move without institutional resistance once, it will try again. And when that logic is applied to allies rather than adversaries, the global order begins to fracture from the inside. What is unfolding is not chaos, it is a deliberate experiment. And experiments, by definition, do not stop until the limits are found. There is a reason Greenland represents a dangerous threshold. This is where the danger escalates. Once Greenland is framed as a European sovereignty test, the question is no longer about territory, it is about whether alliances can survive pressure from their own members. Unlike Venezuela, unlike trade disputes, unlike rhetorical pressure on Canada, Greenland sits inside a structure designed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis.
Denmark is a NATO member. That means Greenland is not just a territory. It is entangled in collective defense obligations that were built on trust, not coercion. NATO functions on the assumption that disputes among allies are resolved through consensus, not pressure, and certainly not through threats of force or annexation. Once that assumption collapses, the alliance itself begins to wobble. If a leading NATO power openly questions the sovereignty arrangements of another member's territory, it forces every ally to confront an unthinkable question: what happens when the threat comes from within? This is the breaking point. Because NATO has no clear mechanism for managing internal coercion. Its deterrence model is outward-facing. It was never designed to restrain the ambitions of its most powerful member. And that is precisely why the current rhetoric is so destabilizing. Allies are placed in an impossible bind. Respond too strongly, and they risk escalating a confrontation they cannot win. Respond too weakly, and they allow a precedent to form, one where power overrides partnership. This is how alliances decay, not through collapse, through quiet erosion. The danger is not immediate war. The danger is the normalization of behavior that makes war conceivable. Strip away the personalities, ignore the headlines, forget the provocation. What remains is a single, unavoidable question. If a president can openly discuss annexation, bypass institutions, weaponize trade against allies, and test the limits of military and economic coercion, what stops the next step? Because history is clear on one point: power that discovers it can move without restraint does not suddenly rediscover restraint on its own. The real audience for this strategy is not Denmark. It is not Canada. It is not even America's rivals. It is the system itself. This is a test of how much resistance remains inside democratic institutions, alliances, and public norms. Each time the system fails to push back, the boundary shifts. Each silence becomes permission. And once that process begins, it rarely reverses quietly. That is why this moment should not only concern allies abroad, it should alarm Americans at home, because the erosion of restraint abroad always returns inward. What is unfolding is not an accident. It is not improvisation. It is not chaos. It is a trajectory. And the most dangerous trajectories are the ones people recognize only after they are already on them.